Alligator Ron Bergeron, a local swamp man, vocally advocates ridding this unique ecosystem of pythons using drones to spot them in the dense marshlands from high above.
At 2,000 feet above the Everglades, thermal cameras detected heat signatures the size of pickup trucks in locations that should have been cold, not once, not randomly, but in the exact same coordinates, night after night, for months. When the South Florida Water Management District finally sent field teams to investigate those coordinates, what they found made one senior researcher say something that would later be quoted in internal reports. "This is the smoking gun we didn't know we were looking for."
We utilize infrared to find the snakes, the differentiation between the temperature of the ground and the temperature of the snakes themselves.
The real mystery wasn't the size of those signatures. It was what was inside them. And what those teams discovered would force Florida to confront a reality that had been growing in the darkness for decades, completely undetected, while daytime observations told everyone the situation was under control. The blind spot. For generations, Florida operated under a comforting assumption. The Everglades had problems, yes. Invasive species, habitat loss, water management challenges.
Wow, how big is this?
10 foot?
Look at its belly. You think that's Steve's baby pig?
No. It's a bird. Feel that?
Really?
Yeah.
That's the rib cage of the bird?
No, that's the feathers, the wing feathers.
I feel it.
Yeah.
These were known quantities, mapped, tracked, managed. Every major ecological threat had been identified, cataloged, and assigned to some agency or conservation program. If a problem was big enough, it would eventually show itself. And if it showed itself, someone would handle it. During the day, this belief felt completely reasonable. You could drive along the Tamiami Trail and see herons wading through shallow water. You could visit Shark Valley and watch alligators sunning themselves on canal banks. Everything looked controlled, balanced, familiar. But here is the catch. Daytime observation has a fundamental limitation. It only shows what happens when the sun is up.
As the water table drops, the alligator's waterfront becomes hot property, and the fish that have flourished here are about to pay a high price.
And in Florida's wetlands, some of the most significant biological activity doesn't begin until after dark. Most traditional ecological assessments rely on what people can see, document, and safely access. They depend on light, on visible signs of presence, on the assumption that if something is large enough, it will eventually reveal itself. That assumption shaped how Florida was understood for decades. When analysts at the University of Florida's Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center began examining thermal surveillance data more closely, comparing footage across multiple flights, multiple seasons, multiple years, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over 400 distinct heat signatures that couldn't be explained by any known species distribution. Biomass concentrations in areas classified as low risk. Signals repeating with mechanical consistency in locations that official maps showed as ecologically quiet. The signatures were too large to be single animals, too stationary to be herds moving through the marsh, too consistent to be equipment errors. Some measured 12 to 15 feet across at ground level, generating thermal readings of 85 to 90 degrees in water that should have been 62. When field teams finally entered these locations, navigating miles of sawgrass and knee-deep water to reach the coordinates, they understood why the data had been so confusing. And get this, they weren't looking at one animal. They were looking at clusters, dense aggregations of adult Burmese pythons some exceeding 16 feet in length, coiled together in masses large enough to generate heat signatures visible from aircraft.
A new high-tech camera is tackling the invasive python problem. The camera uses special wavelengths of light to expose snakes hidden in the Everglades. You can see it here.
Pythons are cold-blooded, but at large sizes, these animals retain warmth for hours after sunset. When multiple individuals gather together for breeding or shelter, the accumulated thermal mass mimics that of a large, warm-blooded mammal. One field team leader described the scene as like lifting a rock and finding a nest of snakes, except the rock was an acre of marsh and the nest contained animals longer than our airboat. These weren't isolated individuals. These were established populations, thriving in areas classified as low priority for invasive species control, areas where regular monitoring was minimal, areas that official maps showed as ecologically stable. For over 2 decades, Florida has publicly reported removing more than 17,000 Burmese pythons from the wild. That number has been held up as evidence that control efforts are working. But current population estimates from the U.S. Geological Survey suggest between 100,000 and 300,000 pythons now inhabit South Florida. The removals weren't reducing the population. They were capturing less than 6% of the lowest estimate. The gap between what had been counted and what actually existed in the darkness was staggering. If you're just now realizing how deep this goes, subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. The edge zones. This changes everything, because those heat signatures didn't stay in the deep wilderness. Over time, they began appearing in locations much closer to where people actually live. Not in city centers, not in suburban backyards, but in the spaces between. The drainage canals that run alongside neighborhoods in Homestead and Florida City. The tree lines at the edges of farmland in the Redlands. The quiet corridors where human infrastructure and wild Florida have always coexisted in uneasy proximity.
It was big enough to hunt down prey the size of an 8-year-old child. A massive python was captured this weekend after being spotted near a Bradenton strip mall. And the man who caught it says there could be many more like it in the Bay Area.
From a biological perspective, this movement makes perfect sense. As pressure increases in core habitat, species expand along the paths of least resistance. In Florida, those paths aren't pristine forests. They're the canals, levees, and drainage systems that humans built to control water and protect property. The same infrastructure designed to keep nature out has become the highway system for its expansion. We created the corridors. We just never expected who would use them. For families living near these edge zones, the implications cut deep. These aren't remote wilderness areas. These are the places where children wait for school buses on dark winter mornings, where evening joggers follow familiar routes along canal paths, where the boundary between controlled civilization and untamed nature has always felt solid and clear. Thermal data from the past 3 years suggests that boundary is far more permeable than anyone realized. Farmers in these regions have noticed effects they couldn't name. Miguel Santos, who has worked tomato fields in the Redlands for 22 years, described finding irrigation equipment disturbed in ways that didn't match typical pest damage. Sections of drip line crushed flat, furrows compressed as if something heavy had crossed them during the night. Small losses that repeat season after season, never catastrophic enough to trigger alarm, but persistent enough to erode profit margins. You learn to recognize what raccoons do, what wild pigs do, Santos said. This wasn't that. Something different is moving through here now. Livestock behavior has shifted near certain fence lines. Dogs that once roamed freely at night now refuse to leave porches after dark. The changes are subtle enough that most people dismiss them as coincidence. But the thermal data validates what residents have been sensing for years. And it's not just wildlife creating these signals. Some heat signatures don't behave like animals at all. They appear at fixed locations beneath small bridges, near abandoned pump stations, along sections of canal that receive little maintenance or oversight. These patterns suggest human activity in spaces that exist outside normal monitoring. The edges of wilderness have always attracted more than wildlife. They attract anyone seeking to avoid attention. For residents, the unease doesn't come from any single identified threat. It comes from uncertainty, from the realization that nighttime reveals a version of their surroundings that daylight never showed them.
Pythons can extend their jaws 4 times their size and will eat almost anything with a pulse. And they'll squeeze their prey till their heart stops beating. If the pythons start making their home this far up north, this ain't just about Florida anymore. This is a national emergency.
And from the uncomfortable question of what else might be operating in those shadows while they sleep. The slow accumulation. When change happens gradually, people rarely notice until the cost becomes unavoidable. Infrastructure. Expenses are climbing across South Florida. Canals require more frequent maintenance. Levees need reinforcement ahead of schedule. Miami-Dade County's budget for wildlife-related infrastructure damage has increased 43% over 5 years, with officials unable to attribute the increase to any single cause. Insurance premiums are shifting. As risk models incorporate new ecological data, some properties find themselves reclassified without any disaster having occurred. No hurricane, no flood, just actuarial tables, updated to reflect changing probability calculations. Families who've lived in the same homes for decades are watching their costs climb for reasons no one can fully explain. Agricultural margins are tightening. Protective measures that once seemed adequate now require constant reinforcement. The Florida Farm Bureau estimates that unexplained crop and equipment losses in edge zone agricultural areas have increased by an average of $12,000 per farm annually since 2019. What all these costs share is their invisibility. There's no single crisis to point to, no moment of obvious failure. Just the slow, grinding expense of maintaining the illusion that everything remains under control. 2 Floridas. Here's what nighttime surveillance has ultimately revealed. Daytime Florida and nighttime Florida occupy the same geography, the same ecosystems, the same infrastructure, but they tell completely different stories about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Daytime Florida is the version that appears in tourism brochures and real estate listings. Managed, monitored, familiar. The version where problems exist but remain contained within boundaries everyone understands. Nighttime Florida is the version that thermal cameras are only now bringing into focus. A landscape where biological activity doesn't follow expected patterns, where human-built infrastructure serves purposes never intended in its original design, where the gap between official maps and actual conditions has been growing silently for decades. The technology didn't create these problems. It simply made them visible. And visibility forces choices that Florida isn't sure how to make. For years, possibly decades, a critical dimension of this state's reality operated entirely outside public awareness. Not because the information didn't exist, but because no one was looking in the right direction. Because daylight created a kind of blindness that only darkness could cure. Right now, while this video plays, a surveillance plane is flying its routine pattern over the Everglades. Its thermal cameras are recording the same heat signatures they've captured for months. And somewhere in the darkness below, in a drainage canal less than 3 miles from the nearest subdivision, a cluster of pythons is settling in for the night, their combined body heat glowing bright enough to see from 2,000 feet in the sky. Tomorrow morning, the families living nearby will wake up, drink their coffee, and send their kids to school. They'll drive past that canal without a second thought. They have no idea what's watching them from the water. Did this change how you see Florida? Hit that like button. Subscribe. If you want to know what other secrets thermal imaging is uncovering across the country. And check out the video appearing on your screen right now, because what researchers just discovered in the Southwest might be even more disturbing than what's lurking in the Everglades.